Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next installment in our Standing Our Holy Ground webinar series about gun violence and what the church can do about it. Welcome. We are glad that you're with us today. This is, as many of you know, a year-long webinar series that's helping the church look at what it can do to address gun violence. This is our 10th webinar in the series, and today's topic is the racial divide in gun violence. The series itself is hosted both by the Presbyterian Peacemaking Program and the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship. It's a collaboration between us. I am Carl Horton, the coordinator of the Presbyterian Peacemaking Program, and my colleague Simon Doon is also with us today monitoring the webinar platform, and he will make sure that everything runs smoothly for us. Let's turn first, before we hear from our panelists for today, to the common understandings that we've been using to help shape and guide our conversation. We consider these a baseline understanding for us when we talk about the difficult topic of gun violence, and we use these, both the panelists and the participants, as we ask questions to guide us through the webinar. So, number one, gun violence is a public health epidemic that impacts our communities, congregations, and members, whether they know it or not. Number two, the impact of gun violence is disproportionate, affecting some individuals and communities often and others seldom. Three, we must first understand the impact of gun violence by listening to gun violence survivors, victims, and those who experience it. Number four, the gun violence prevention movement is not anti-gun. Five, the Second Amendment does not preclude reasonable, sensible gun violence prevention legislation. Six, addressing gun violence will require changes in the legislation and culture of our nation. Seven, the Presbyterian Church USA has issued clear policy and strong statements on preventing gun violence, but true change requires action and advocacy by our members and congregations. Number eight, as people of faith, we must pay attention to the discrepancies between the teachings of our faith tradition and the messaging of media and special interest groups. Nine, our webinar series is an opportunity for constructive conversation and learning, and not for posturing and polarizing rhetoric that has characterized the gun violence debate. And finally, 10, our panelists and participants in the series will demonstrate mutual respect, listen for understanding, and engage in a way that bears witness to the best values of our best values and practices of their faith tradition. Okay, and the way that we invite you to submit questions, and our time of Q&A is for you to use the Q&A tab that's on your control bar. If you scroll your cursor over that bar, you should see a Q&A tab, and from that you can type a question. And we ask that you would not only tell us if it's a question for both of our panelists or one of our panelists in particular today, but also keep in mind our common understandings as you phrase those questions. All right, I have the privilege of introducing our panelists. I'm going to introduce them one at a time. We'll hear from them individually, and then we'll engage in some conversation and have time for question and answer. So our first speaker for today is the Reverend Dr. R. Drew Smith, who is Professor of Urban Ministry at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. He's also both a political scientist and a clergy person who has initiated and directed a number of projects related to religion and public life. These projects have collected research data on political involvements, community development activities, and outreach ministries of churches, especially African American churches. He also has served since 2010 as co-convener of the Transatlantic Roundtable on Religion and Race, an initiative that convenes scholars, religious leaders, and community activists from across the transatlantic region for purposes of advancing progressive approaches to persistent racial problems in various contexts. Welcome, Dr. Drew Smith, and we are really grateful to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, Carl, and greetings to all. Appreciate the common understandings that you outlined. I thought those were all very, very strong and on point. I'd like to just share some information today about this crisis of gun violence here in the U.S. Information that might provide some bridging into deeper discussion about this issue. Some of this will probably be familiar to many of our participants. Some may be new information. But what I'd like to do is to sort of zoom out first on the problem and look broadly, both internationally, so some comparative data internationally, and then nationally, state by state, city by city, then zoom in on a specific neighborhood. I think that some of this conversation today is based at Purdue University, if I'm not mistaken. So right here in the state of Indiana, anyway, I'm from Indianapolis originally, and I'm talking to you today from Indianapolis. So I'll be looking at an Indianapolis neighborhood for kind of a close-up look on some of this, and then to talk a little bit about responses to this problem, both at broad policy levels, but then also some of the ways that faith communities are coming alongside the issue. So first slide, and I'll have to keep indicating change the slide because Simon will be changing the slides from his end. I won't be able to do it from my end. First slide, please. So as you see, gun violence is quite a large problem, obviously. 1 in 3 people in the US know someone who has been shot. Homicide rate is 20 times higher than the combined rates in the US, that is, than the combined rates in 22 countries with similar wealth and population to the US. And an average of 7 children and teens under the age of 20 are killed by guns every day. If I'm not mistaken, many of the people on this webinar today are younger generation participants. So you see that this is clearly a problem very widely impacting people in your age group. Next slide. When you compare gun ownership by countries, the statistics obviously point to a disproportionate gun ownership in the United States as compared with countries around the world. There were more than twice as many firearms owned per 100 residents in the US than the next highest country rate. And frankly, I mean, the US has got, so we're looking at 140 small arms per 100 residents, meaning that essentially every resident in the US owns about 1.5 firearms. Next slide. Almost 34,000 people died by gun violence in the United States in 2016. That's an enormous number of people. The vast majority of those, surprisingly, died by suicide, almost 23,000 people. Another 15,000 almost died in homicides, and about 71 died in mass shootings within the United States. Next slide. So mass shootings in the US, clearly a problem that we have grieved in recent years, even more than in the decades previous. So between 2009 and 2018, almost 1,200 Americans were killed, 836 more were wounded in 194 mass shootings during that roughly 10-year period, 19 shootings each year. Among the casualties, 309 children. Teens were killed, children and teens were killed, 194 more wounded. 19 law enforcement officers killed, 23 wounded. Next slide. So you can look at this graph here and see that between those years, that time frame, roughly 20 per year, 19, 20 per year were killed in just mass shootings. Next slide. When we look at the number of murders by city in the US based on 2015 data, and this data does not, the order of incidents by city does not change dramatically from one year to another over the last decade or so. You'll probably find these 10 cities listed in some order within the top 10 cities with respect to murder rates over the last 10 years. You can see the cities in front of you there. Next slide. Here we have some data that examines the problem by race. And I'm sure it's not new information for many that this is a problem disproportionately impacting African American communities. You see African American communities 3 to 4 times almost in the 1990s, the rate of white victims of homicide. That ratio has lessened in the 2000s to roughly 10, well, twice as many African American, more than twice, just over twice as many African American homicide victims as white victims. And then the offenders, the 2000s, again, just roughly twice as many African American offenders as white offenders. Next slide. So let's zoom in now and look at this problem at a neighborhood level. So gun homicides, first of all, so when we look at the geographies of this, gun homicides are concentrated primarily in cities. Half of all gun homicides took place in just 127 cities, representing about a quarter of the US population. Within those cities, gun homicides are most prevalent in racially segregated neighborhoods with high rates of poverty. We'll say more about that later. These are small neighborhoods totaling about 1,200 census tracts. And that's a very important piece of information there, that the problem of homicide and of gun violence, urban gun violence, is highly concentrated in relatively small geographies across the country and within specific cities. 1,200 census tracts, meaning a few square blocks, account for these concentrations of homicide. Next slide. When we look at Indianapolis, city of Indianapolis, city where I'm originally from and currently maintain a home, even though I work in Pittsburgh. Indianapolis is not one of the most prevalent murder sites in the US, 28th ranking among cities in 2015. But nonetheless, homicide rates in Indianapolis are on the increase, very much so on the increase over the last 10 to 15 years, increasing by about 19% between 2007 and 2014, and continuing to increase up through 2020. And we're already this year on a record-setting pace for homicide in Indianapolis, and have set new records for every year for the past 3 to 4 years in the city of Indianapolis. Next slide. You can see this sort of inclining arc of homicide rates in the city of Indianapolis. Next slide. Mostly male victims, not surprisingly so, 4 to 5 times more male than female victims, but female victims still account for a troublingly large number of homicide victims in the city of Indianapolis. When you look at this, next slide, when you look at this in terms of sort of a plotting, a mapping of these homicides, and this is for 2014 through 2018, you can see sort of a concentration of those homicides within specific neighborhoods within the city of Indianapolis, including the neighborhood where I grew up. Next slide. The neighborhood I grew up in was Martindale Brightwood. second ranking in murders among Indianapolis neighborhoods. 43% of Indianapolis murders were in the 3 zip codes that constitute this Martindale Brightwood neighborhood. It's a little hard to see on the map, but it's pretty much the dark pink coloring toward the center of the map there would be the Martindale Brightwood neighborhood. Next slide. Those who may have some greater familiarity with Indianapolis could kind of see how the neighborhood is juxtaposed to other neighborhoods. On the left-hand map, you can see toward the right top part of the map, Martindale Brightwood located there. But anyway, it's many neighborhoods in the city of Indianapolis, Martindale Brightwood being a historic one with a historic level of problem with respect to gun violence. Next slide, please. So a little of descriptive information about that neighborhood. It was a poverty target area in 1970 by the city government. Martindale Brightwood is one of those neighborhoods that experienced significant exodus of population and resources during the 1960s in particular, and up through the 1970s and 1980s. Middle class Blacks, working class, upper working class Blacks, and the vast majority of the white population that comprised that neighborhood exited in large numbers in the 1960s and into the 1970s, largely as a result of integration that was now a feature of social life within Indianapolis by the 1960s as a result of the civil rights movement. So persons with the Black African Americans with greater resources and means were able to move into neighborhoods they previously not lived in, which meant that the neighborhoods they had historically been concentrated in lost those populations. And then as Black populations were moving more into neighborhoods across Indianapolis, white populations continued to move further and further out. As resourceful populations moved out, the commercial sector, banks, stores, and so forth, moved with the resourceful population, leaving these neighborhoods bereft of the kind of resources that could really sustain and help these neighborhoods to grow and to thrive. So loss of manufacturing jobs across the city of Indianapolis, 10,000 jobs lost in many of these neighborhoods since 2007. In Martindale Brightwood, no medical facilities or medical offices. Currently, the 4 public schools in the Martindale Brightwood neighborhood are underperforming schools. It is home to a historic Black Catholic high school. 2 of the schools that were in the neighborhood were closed down in the last 20 years. It's a law enforcement target area. And as all this is going on, it still manages to be home to more than 80 churches. Next slide, please. You can see a little bit about population decline here from this graph. From 1960 to 2000, a loss of population from just over 25,000 to down to 9,000. Next slide. You also see that the housing situation within that neighborhood shifts dramatically from being predominantly owner-occupied homes, 2/3 of those being of that category in 1970, to under 50% homeowner-occupied houses by 2010. And the renter population grows, as does the vacancies in neighborhoods. So that can help you sort of picture in your mind declining housing stock that matches declining resources in terms of jobs, income, and organizational resources within these neighborhoods over that 40-year period. Poverty rate increases from 1990 from 26% to 38%. The population becomes younger. in that period of time. So some of the demographic and sociological features impacting that neighborhood. Next slide, please. Unemployment in Martindale Brightwood, almost 50%, well, almost less than 50% are employed. So that means over 50% are not counted or are not actively in the workforce for one reason or another. Church membership under 50% in that neighborhood, and participation in churches fairly low. So next slide. So to summarize what we see happening in a neighborhood, again, neighborhoods being where a lot of gun violence are concentrated, particularly when those neighborhoods and specific census tracts within those neighborhoods are characterized by sort of racial homogeneity, segregation, characterized by high poverty, by transience in terms of residency, underemployment, undereducation, over-incarceration, low social bridging and bonding capital, meaning that there are few platforms, organizational or otherwise, within these neighborhoods where people can really build community together, where there can be a sense of community, a sense of mutuality, a sense of a common and shared stake in the life of the community. Also, these neighborhoods are characterized by high access to illegal and legal guns, and therefore disproportionate levels of gun violence. Okay, next slide. And I'm just about finished here. I think I've got maybe 5 minutes left. So types of potential responses to this crisis. Clearly, policy advocacy is where so much work needs to be done, particularly as it relates to ensuring stricter access to guns. And hopefully on the next slide, Simon, types of potential responses to this crisis. Yes, stricter access to, you can go back. Seem to have lost a slide here. Okay, Federal Firearms Act of 1930, I think that was the one that we just, excuse me.
I think that's the one that's up right now.
Okay, Federal Firearms Act of 1938 required importers, manufacturers, importers, and dealers to a Federal Firearms License Control Act. Okay, next slide. Gun Control Act of 1968, following the assassinations of President Kennedy, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, and Dr. Martin Luther King, President Johnson pushed for the passage of a Gun Control Act that would repeal and replace and update the National Firearms Act to fix constitutional issues, add language about destructive devices such as bombs, mines, and grenades, and expand the definition of machine gun. Next slide. We skip past that one. Next slide. The Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act of 1993. You'll recall White House Press Secretary James Brady was shot in 1993. And as a result of that, some legislation came into place, signed into law by President Clinton, which required background checks before a gun is purchased from a licensed dealer, manufacturer, or importer, and it established the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. Those things are being contested, as you'll see from the next slide. Public Safety and Recreational Firearms Use Protection Act of 1994 outlawed the ability to manufacture. So this is still placing restrictions. Outlawed the ability to manufacture, transfer, or possess semi-automatic assault weapons unless lawfully possessed. Next slide. 2005. So those restrictive acts were coming mainly through Democratic presidential administrations. You move into 2005, you're in a Republican presidential administration. The Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act was signed by President Bush to prevent gun manufacturers from being named in federal or state civil lawsuits by victims of gun violence. Next slide. 2008, you had a district court, federal court ruling, Columbia versus Haler, which changed the 70-year precedent that focused on well-regulated militia portion of the Second Amendment and strengthened individual rights to possess a firearm unconnected with service in a militia. It also challenged the constitutionality of a 32-year-old handgun ban in Washington, D.C., and found that handgun ban and trigger lock requirements violated the Second Amendment. Next slide. Continued debates over loopholes in private gun sales. And there's several things there. I won't go through all of those. Let's just keep moving here. But again, these loopholes are being debated even as we speak today. Next slide. So background checks being part of what continues to be debated. So the policy issues, next slide. Policy issues are clearly huge and contested, right? So this slide demonstrates just the kind of split in terms of popular support for stricter gun laws. About 60%, and this is data from the last few years, 2019 or so, about 60% think that we need stricter, and these are 60% of US citizens surveyed in this poll suggest that we need stricter gun restriction laws. About 30% think we're about right, and about 11% seem to think that we need to be less strict on that. You can see differences there right underneath between Democrats and Republicans, with Democrats more in favor of stricter gun laws, Republicans less in favor of it. You see that women are more in favor of stricter gun laws than men. You see that younger and more elderly people are slightly more in favor of stricter gun laws, and college educated are more in favor of stricter gun laws. Next slide. Also to remember though that gun laws will not prevent completely access to illegal guns, but weak gun regulations can contribute to illegal gun availability. Next slide. So for example, in the state of Indiana, because Indiana's ranked as one of the states with weaker gun laws of all the states in the US, generally ranked in the bottom 10 or 15 in the country in terms of weakness of gun laws. Many illegal guns from Indiana end up in adjacent states that may have stricter gun laws, and many illegal guns from Indiana end up in Chicago, right next door to us, where there has been a significant problem of gun violence in recent years. Next slide. So types of potential responses to the crisis: clearly stricter access to gun laws, but also responding to neighborhood ecologies of violence. And I'm almost completed here. So next slide. Investing in neighborhood ecologies of violence. So investment in values-oriented and skills development-oriented institutions, meaning public schools, for example, values-oriented, values-sharing institutions where young people are formed in many ways. How can we pay attention to a kind of value formation within public school settings that may help to reduce propensity toward conflict, propensity toward violence, and certainly propensity toward gun violence. Next slide. So there are ways that this has been systematically pursued in recent years by churches, where churches have come alongside schools to partner with schools through tutoring, through mentoring, through providing additional resources to under-resourced schools, resourcing particularly around things that are left out of many of our public school settings that might be quite important toward helping to form a kind of imagination of things beautiful, of things that might lead to peace. The music programs, the creative arts programs, so forth, humanities related programs within our schools. So One Church, One School is a very effective program that has been launched 10 or 20 years ago by one of the historic African-American denominations, the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. They have dozens of partnerships between their congregations and local public schools. Adopt a School Initiative is a very large partnering program that is sponsored and based by Reverend Tony Evans Church in Dallas, Texas, a very large congregation, evangelical congregation, African-American evangelical congregation, where they partner with schools across the country. United Church of Christ denomination has a church school partnership where they're partnering with multiple congregations across the country as well. And last slide, there are church partnerships, and need to be far more, not only with schools, but with programs that are on the front lines, on the ground in neighborhoods where conflict is rife. So organizations like the Boston 10-Point Coalition, which since the 1990s have deployed on urban streets where church members have come alongside gang members and tried to form relationships, tried to discourage violence, tried to encourage participation in more productive kinds of relationships and activities and involvements, and have had some success with that program, not only in Boston, but in cities across the country, including a chapter in the city of Indianapolis that has been quite effective. And then there is a program also in Indianapolis called Peace Peddlers, which is an online, mainly an online curriculum that serves students in schools from pre-K all the way through high school, with various curricular resources and training exercises and practices that lend themselves to peacemaking, that help people to work through and understand ways of addressing conflict. And these programs have been made available to a lot of school systems around the country, including in Indianapolis. Churches have been supportive of that type of initiative as well. And so there are these examples and many other examples that can be determined through proper searches and explorations of ways that churches, including the Presbyterian Church USA, might be able to systematically come alongside people who are actively addressing these issues and to engage themselves directly in activities and approaches and practices that might lend themselves to a less conflictual world, particularly in our urban context, and especially as it relates to gun violence.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Dr. Drew Smith. I want to get Robert Hoggard in here, Reverend Robert Hoggard. Let me introduce you quickly, Robert, and then we'll have you jump into this conversation. Reverend Hoggard earned his bachelor's degree from American Baptist College, and he's got his master's from Colgate Rochester Crozier Divinity School, both in theological studies. In his master's thesis, Reverend Hoggard explored bridging the gap between the Black Lives Matter movement and the Black Church. He leads the board at Metro Justice as its vice president. In that role, he is assisting in the formation of the Rochester Police Accountability Board and pushing for an end to cash bail and new discovery and speedy trial laws. He's earning his PhD right now in education at the University of Rochester. His dissertation pertains to the intersection of the K-12 education system, public policy, workforce development, and higher education. Reverend Hoggard's work fights for an education system that prepares Black and brown people for college or work rather than the street corner or the prison system. Reverend Robert Hoggard. Thank you for being here with us today and joining in this conversation.
Thanks for having me. It was a great start to this conversation to start with Dr. Smith's sort of way that he sort of dovetailed into this conversation. I sort of want to pick up where he left off and talk there about my master's thesis, and then have that be a platform to talk about other issues related to this matter. In that thesis, we interviewed 10 people, many of which were pastors, many of which were activists, to really talk about how in this day and age have we been working around issues. And one of the two biggest things that we found is that, number one, there was a large consensus that there were theologies that weren't inclusive for everyone. And we could spend the whole sort of conversation on that. But there was another piece where, number two, there was sort of this breakdown between activists, many who thought that the church should come to them and ask them what they needed and support them. And then there were many pastors who said, no, they should come to us. They should seek out us. And if they don't ask, how will we support? And so that was a really sort of basic breakdown of, okay, let's have the conversation. And so we found out when you have the conversation, then we can find out further how it is that we support people in communities. And so that one of the easiest things, or the most simplistic things I'll say today, is you got to have the conversation. You got to have the conversation with people in the community who are embedded in these issues and can tell you what's happening, and can actually tell you how to specifically support them. And in many ways, it can be very basic elements of support. So also in the thesis, we talked about how the church was integral in the civil rights movement, right? We had in the time 40 ministers, including Dr. King, start the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And when you had the church be an integral part of movement building, right? And while there were many concerns within those elements in the 60s about women, about LGBTQ, there was still this optimal support that churches had of movement building. They were integral in, number one, organizing protests. They were integral in, number two, actually funding work and cutting checks. There was number three, there was an education element. They were educating people on issues, making sure people knew the facts and the empirical data that backed everything up. And number four, there was this ideology of liberation, that we can be free and we can seek a way out of where we are now. And in that tension, you see that happen, but you also did see that many churches were not on board. And in King's letter to a Birmingham jail, from the Birmingham jail, he said, the contemporary church is often weak, ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound. It is so often the arch supporter of the status quo. And so I think we have this conversation to say, how is it that we can go against the status quo? Because we see so many people in a rich biblical text who sort of push change, and so many people who sort of push the ideology and the tenor of society. And how do we do that? And how are we the hands and feet of Jesus on the earth? And so we also dovetail into the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Which was built around the sort of ideology of Assata Shakur, who said, I've declared war on the rich who prosper on our poverty, the politicians who lie to us with smiling faces, and all of the mindless, heartless robots who protect them and their property. She also said, the rulers of this country have always considered their property more important than our lives, right? And so they were centered in sort of her rich sort of relevance and how things are the way they are and what people really care about. And so as we move into the practical suggestions, I say, and I pose a question to you, does your theology suffocate protest? And that was one of the names of the chapters in the thesis is, does your theology suffocate protest, right? What are you saying on Sunday that can sort of move the tenor of these issues and sort of move how we think? Because if we move how we think, we can move how we act. And another thing I'll say is that a lot of times we talk in this gun debate about restrictions and access and sort of the person, getting access to the gun. But we don't talk about the intersectionality of all the issues that sort of bring a person to pick up the gun in the first place. And so we, at the Community Justice Action Fund, where I was a Speakers Bureau last year, we got out a whiteboard and we say, what are all of the things that sort of lead to someone picking up a gun in the first place? These are some of the things that we all came up with together. And it was number one, heteronormativity, xenophobia, demilitarization of police, misogyny, white supremacy, America's obsession with violence, the CIA, hatred, disabling of families, hatred towards women, organ harvesting, media, toxic masculinity, the education system, poverty, criminal justice, housing crisis, the profit of death, trauma, conflict resolution, pride, ego, colonialism, gentrification, and lack of opportunity. And so we see how all of these sort of issues sort of corroborate a reality of a person and lead a person to picking up the gun in the first place. And I'll stop there and say, I want this to be a sort of dialogue. And I wanted to stop early intentionally so that we can dialogue together on what you see happening at your church context and how we as a panel can be helpful to some of the things you're thinking about and some of the things you want to be supportive in your context to sort of be impactful in this society. So I like to open it up for questions early and
Great.
panel.
Yeah. Thank you.
Help us.
That's wonderful. I will remind our participants to use the control panel to post questions, and I'm going to give you a minute to be doing that. I see one is coming in, but let me see if we can get a few more questions, and then I'll offer them to the panelists as a set of questions. The information you both have provided is really helpful. I really appreciate the focused presentation by Dr. Smith on Indianapolis, in particular neighborhoods and where gun violence is really focused. I mean, I know Indianapolis as well, Drew, and I can see that it is largely in communities of color and poor communities. I wonder if the first thing I want to ask is the chart about the demographics that want stricter gun laws. I saw that gender-based and age and politically divided. Do either of you know about a racial divide as far as among particularly, Black males? Young Black males are the ones who are primarily the victims of gun violence from those statistics. Do either of you know about our African American communities and whether they prefer stricter gun laws? I mean, I sure saw a divide among Democrats and Republicans. That was interesting, Dr. Smith, on your chart. But do you think there is a divide among people of color and white people about the strictness of our gun laws?
Right. Yeah, unfortunately, that chart that I used did not break out by race, but
Okay.
my recollection of the statistics around that are that African Americans are noticeably more in favor of stricter gun laws because obviously their communities are most heavily affected
Hmm.
by gun violence. And there's also less of a kind of Second Amendment culture that permeates African American communities.
Yeah. I mean, I
Yeah.
don't think there's anything to add to that. Are we seeing any other questions?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just getting the other question. Actually, Kevin Johnson, it's not a question, but he is encouraging um, the study of the Boston 10-point coalition story. Are either of you aware of that?
The study of it?
Well, it says, but encouraging suggestion to study the Boston 10-point coalition story.
Right, right. Yeah, there is actually quite a bit that has been publicly conveyed about the 10-point coalition, the National 10-point coalition program. I know back in probably the late 90s or early 2000s, 60 Minutes actually did a segment on the Boston 10-point coalition where Reverend Eugene Rivers, one of the co-founders, was interviewed quite extensively. There has been other television coverage of the National 10-point Coalition. There have been entire books written about the 10-point Coalition and lots of articles. So there is information about the National 10-point Coalition. There's one of the volumes that I edited. I believe it's the volume called Long March Ahead, which was published in 2006. Has a chapter written by Harvard sociologist Christopher Winship, where he examines data on homicide rates in Boston, and I believe compares that data with homicide rates in New York City, and looks at how the 10-point coalition active in Boston may have impacted. I mean, so looking at the data, looking at declines in homicide rates in Boston over a designated period of time may be related to the effectiveness of the 10-point coalition strategy within Boston. So there's some good information out there for anyone who wants to take a closer look at how that program has approached these issues and some of the results.
Okay. Okay, so Google the National 10-point Coalition to learn more about that. Robert, did you want to say a word about that?
Yeah, there's also a group that I know that is centered here and centered in Boston, the Boston area, Teen Empowerment. And they've been very integral in sort of incubating, like Dr. Smith said earlier, students while they're young, while they're teenagers, and sort of giving, pushing them a sense of agency, and have sort of educating them to be sort of political actors and think differently about these issues and sort of curb violence before it can ever even happen by working with public schools and working with people who might by society be deemed at risk, but to the program and by us be seen at promise. And so that's also connected to that, but I will do a little bit more reading on that issue because it was very impactful in its time.
Great. There's another question that came in, and it comes out of Reverend Hoggard, your comments, I think. So I would start with you on this one. you know, you talked about the status quo and the church promoting the status quo or challenging it. So this question is about faith communities and what we can do to disrupt the motivations. You gave a great list of what motivates somebody to pick up a gun, and it was a pretty expansive list. Allison Carr is asking, what do you have any suggestions for what people of faith can do to help interrupt that or disrupt people from picking up that gun? And then she also asks you to expand a bit on the notion of theology that doesn't suffocate protest, how people of faith can cultivate that theology.
Yeah, so I'll focus on one and don't tell any other. The suggestions I'll work with first. You know, we thought about some suggestions, and what one could be, as we spoke about earlier, you know, financially supporting a grassroots organization that's working on some of the issues that sort of lead to a person picking up a gun. And there are organizations all across the country that are, you know, immersed in the communities of your churches that you can partner with to sort of work on some of these issues to sort of curb this violence. I would also say we can do more, or find out ways where your church can do more to educate people on these issues. Maybe it's having a teach-in, maybe it's doing a sermon series. And there are some things that I've seen done, but could be done at a higher level to sort of educate people on these issues, because we're really depending on mass media and the 60 seconds of television to really frame things. And we got to do more deep dives into how we've gotten here in the first place. And then I would also say, look at Community Justice Action Fund, some of the work we're doing, where we're really talking about the gun debate and the gun sort of conversation from a Black and brown lens, which we've seen a lot we've seen not enough traction in that area. And I also say for the theology question, you know, I think it's, you know, it's clear that, you know, we're seeing some separation of churches on the LGBTQ issue. You know, you're seeing the United Methodist Church split over that issue. And that's something that many millennials and many younger folks are really concerned about. How do we be inclusive for all? And one of the things I might suggest is that as a preacher, I always try to hinge myself on all of the rich stories of people challenging the status quo. You know, there's many of theologies that say Jesus challenged the status quo, and Jesus died because he challenged that Roman Empire. And so how do we sort of on Sunday use those scriptures that sort of lift us and liberate us? And I also say very quickly, so we can move on, that there was a study done on sort of the frequency of congregants and their sort of mental health status. And many have found that those who frequent on Sunday and hear that sermon are less likely to become depressed, or less likely to have that sort of and face these sort of issues. So I'll say that to sort of help harmonize that question. I hope I answered that question in a quick fashion.
I appreciate the idea that being in the community of faith helps people stay connected and not be so isolated. I think isolation can also lead to violence if you feel alone. So yeah, I would think coming to church, hearing a challenging message that maybe disrupts a little bit of our complacency within the faith community is a good thing. We've had a couple of other suggestions come in while you've been speaking, and then we'll, I think we're gonna have to move to conclude. So Deanna Hollis, who works with the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, particularly with the issue of gun violence, says, hey, what if churches picked up trash in areas impacted by violence? So what if church groups actually went into communities? I don't know if picking up trash is the only thing we do in communities of violence, but move into those places and be present with the communities. So was one of her, she's got a question on the end of that. So maybe one of you might want to respond to that. The other, Kevin Johnson, who's in Detroit, suggests looking into ceasefire that was utilized by the Department of Justice as an interventive model. When we had our General Assembly in Detroit, we had a panel that included ceasefire as an intervention there that was dealing with the inner city and violence. So thank you, Kevin, for that reminder. Okay, Dr. Smith or Reverend Hoggard, any final comments or questions or statements, I guess?
Yeah, let me say quickly in response to the inquiry about a kind of presence in community, picking up trash or whatever. Presence is very important. It speaks to that issue of relationality. So clearly, relationality is a significant dimension of how we move beyond conflict to relationship, how we move beyond conflict to community. So we have to look at all sorts of ways to be relational, and it's hard to be relational if we're not present, if we're not fully coming alongside others that we hope to be in community with. So any ways that we can figure out to authentically do that, yeah, I think that that's important. To also the spiritual dimension that that Reverend Hoggard speaks to is clearly significant, and it's not just a matter of being in church. It's a matter of being intentional through our ministries in ways that we speak into the spiritual. And I think that we've seen some slippage on that matter. I mean, we are kind of in church, but we're not always necessarily grounded in a fixed spirituality. And I think we need to pay close attention to that to allow for the work of the Holy Spirit to intervene and disrupt all of our lives, including those who might be on paths that are heading toward destruction. So not only do we look at the social structural ways of disrupting some of these counterproductive patterns, but let's look at the relational and at the spiritual as well. And ceasefire is a very important model. Again, these are folks that have been out on the front lines, in neighborhoods, on the ground, trying to be in relationship with people who may be prone toward or on the verge of violence to disrupt that pattern. And sometimes at great risk to those who are out trying to engage in that kind of work. So yeah, it's been a very effective program that needs to be replicated much more widely.
Yeah, and Robert Hoggard, before your final comments, let me just say Rashida Hastings asked a question that maybe you could speak to as you conclude. So if we do enter neighborhoods, communities impacted, as Dr. Smith was able to say in Indianapolis, for instance, there are very targeted neighborhoods where this violence, not targeted, but they are isolated. They are places where there's greater incidence of violence. She wants to know, how do we identify where to go in our communities if there are so many being impacted? Are there resources for churches to say, hey, here's where we want to go and be a presence? I think she's just wondering because it seems overwhelming in each community. How do you decide?
Yeah, I think what Dr. Drew sort of referred to earlier, where he had those sort of dots in each sort of zip code. Yeah. You see a strong correlate between the communities that are hit hardest the most, and it's seen in a lot of different zip codes. And perhaps you can pick by the ones that are hit hardest the most, and you say, hey, in the first quarter of the year, we're going to hit zip code da 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 da. In the second quarter, we're going to hit zip code da 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 da, and move sort of from the hardest hit first and see what organizations are incubated in those spaces. For us in Rochester, it's 14621, where you see poverty and crime sort of intersecting each other. So I would say go to the hardest hit first, see what organizations are already working and how you connect with them, and how do you get in and listen first and then act. And that's what I would say.
That's a nice reminder to listen first. We're going to accompany. We got to listen first before we just walk in and do. Okay, well, I have been asked to restate both of your names clearly so people know, I think, how to reach you if they want to see you, talk to you afterwards. So thank you to both Reverend Dr. R. Drew Smith of Pittsburgh Theological Seminary and Reverend Robert Hoggard. And Robert, you are in Rochester.
Yes.
Which Rochester?
Rochester, New York.
Thank you, sir. Okay. All right. You can find Robert Hoggard in Rochester, New York, working on a PhD at the University of Rochester.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you both for being with us today. It has been really helpful. Before we conclude, I want to remind folks that our next webinar is on April 15th. It'll be at 2 o'clock in Eastern time. Remember, that'll be daylight savings time. It's a conversation with the Sandy Hook Promise organization about their efforts to address gun violence and the guidance they have for faith communities. We're going to be joined by Donald Gaffney, who is a pastor and an alum of Sandy Hook back in his day. He's author of a new resource, a new book called Common Ground, talking about gun violence in America. We'll also be joined by Nicole Hockley, who is managing director of the Sandy Hook Promise. So that will be a great conversation. We hope you'll be able to all join us then. You know, to register for the webinars, just go to our webpage, presbyterianmission.org/standing our holy ground, and you will see a link to all of the webinars, the ones that are recorded that you can watch anytime. So this one will be recorded, is being recorded, and will be available for you all who missed it to see it or to see it again and get some of those slides with statistics and images. And then sign up for one of our future webinars. We continue in April, and we've got several lined up for us. So we'll sign off for today. Thank you all for being with us. We really appreciate the collective impact of the faith community on this really difficult issue. So thank you, Dr. Smith, Reverend. It's been good being together. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.